Baptist perspective, and tonight we're going to be looking at a topic that is pretty controversial in our day, and that's Christian nationalism. If you've heard of that term before, and so it's something that I'm hearing a lot about, and you hear a lot about more and more, it seems like. And so, so what is Christian nationalism? When we talk about that, what do we mean by that? It's kind of hard to define because there are people who give different definitions of it, and it kind of depends who you talk to as to what that means. But here is a simple definition, I think, that's pretty good, and I think most people would agree with it. And this is a guy, Paul Miller, who wrote on this, and he says, Christian nationalism is the belief that America is a Christian nation and that government ought to keep it that way. Okay, so that's his definition of it. The idea that America is a Christian nation and that the government ought to keep it that way, keep it as a Christian nation. So it has the idea of government supporting Christianity in particular, and maybe a better way to talk about it. And here's what we'll talk about tonight: Christian nationalism in the sense that the idea that the government should be supporting and promoting Christianity. And so there are a lot of people who would call themselves Christian nationalists that really believe that. And that's something that they think the government should do. So here's one of the things. I got you know how you get Facebook ads all the time, and I got one, and this is from a guy named James Baird, and he wrote a book very recently called King of Kings. And here's what he says. He says, so the book has one main idea. It's that the government must promote true religion, and that means it must promote Christianity, because Christianity is the only true religion, and that this is a duty that anyone who holds civil office must fulfill. And so this guy is saying that the government not only should promote Christianity, but now, obviously, I agree, right? The government, that Christianity is the only true religion, is the only one that's true. But he says the government should promote that, and that it should be the duty of anybody who holds public office to also promote that. So he would be saying that somebody who holds public office should be a Christian, or at least say that they're Christian and promote Christianity. Another one. This was a statement. Okay, there's a guy up in Idaho, Doug Wilson. He's getting a lot more press, more and more, it seems like. I think one of the major news outlets had an interview with him. I forget which one it was. But so he's in Moscow, Idaho, kind of like northern Idaho. And he's promoting the idea of kind of Christian nationalism. I think he uses that term. But here's what he says. He says the magistrate, so that's a civil official, has a duty to protect the church of our common Lord without giving preference to any denomination of Christians above the rest. The magistrate should be uniquely protective of Baptists, Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists, and including in that list any other body that can lay claim to being a church that belongs to our quote-unquote common Lord. The Christian faith would get preferential treatment. And so he's saying that not just one particular denomination should the government promote, but Christianity in general, and none of those denominations should be persecuted or should be rise above any of the other ones. So that's kind of his view of it. And so this is just something that we're seeing more and more and hearing more and more about. And especially when politics gets divided, part of it is because our nation has become much more secular oriented, in the sense that not as many people have a Christian worldview like there used to be in our nation. And so because of that, I think it's becoming more prominent. We've got to do something to fix this. And so maybe what needs to happen is that the government needs to promote Christianity more, like that. So the question is that biblical? Is that something that the government should do? Should we be Christian nationalists? Is it a good idea for the government to promote Christianity? From my perspective, and I'm coming at it again from a regular Baptist perspective, I would say no. And I would like to say all Baptists would say that, but it's not true because a lot of Baptists wouldn't. A lot of Baptists would say no, that the government should promote Christianity as well. But I think it's inconsistent with Baptist beliefs about what we call the separation of church and state. So let's talk about what that means. Let me just say this, that let me give you a couple quotes from some Baptists from years ago, and just give you an idea of what traditional Baptist beliefs were like. So these are two guys who were Baptist preachers back during the time of the Revolution. Okay, so Isaac Backus is the first one. He was in Massachusetts, and he wrote this in 1773. And he said, God has appointed two kinds of government in the world, which are distinct in their nature and ought never to be confounded together, one of which is called civil, the other ecclesiastical government. What he's saying is that two spheres, you got church and you got state, one being civil, the state, and the other being ecclesiastical, the church, and that these should not be confounded with each other. They're distinct in nature and should remain that way. So that was Isaac Backus, who, by the way, was a supporter of the Revolutionary War, which is interesting. Another one is John Leland. He was a pastor from Virginia, and this is a few years later in 1790. And he was one of the pushers for the First Amendment and for a Bill of Rights. When the Constitution was, they were having the Constitutional Convention, there was no Bill of Rights originally, and John Leland was one of them that was really pushing for it. And he would write letters to James Madison in particular. And so the idea of the First Amendment was really, not that he invented it, but it was really being pushed by a Baptist preacher. And so he said the notion of a Christian commonwealth should be exploded forever. He said, government should protect every man in thinking and speaking freely and see that one does not abuse another. But he's saying not to prefer Christians over others, and that the government shouldn't be Christian itself, but that it should protect every person and give every person freedom to speak freely and to not abuse each other. Okay. So that was kind of the classic idea of Baptist idea of separation of church and state. And so let's just talk about biblically where this idea comes from, what it's grounded in, several scriptures, and that will show us some biblical principles for this. You go over to John chapter 18, and this one I think is, this place says it as clear as anything, I think. And this is John 18. This is where Jesus is before Pilate. So he's on trial, and so we have Jesus interacting with somebody, an official from the Roman government. So you've got religion, okay, Jesus, right? I mean, if anybody was religious, it was him, interacting with the state, with Pilate. And so John 18, verse 33. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said unto him, Art thou the king of the Jews? So Pilate's asking him, are you a king? Okay. Now, in what sense is Pilate asking that? He's probably thinking civil, right? Are you a king like Caesar is? Is that what you're claiming to be? Because if so, then it's kind of treason against Rome. Okay. And so he wants to find that out. And so verse 34, Jesus answered him, sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? So at first Jesus kind of dodges the question, doesn't he? A little bit. Are you saying this of yourself, or did somebody else tell you this? Who would have told him that? Well, the Jewish leaders, right? Verse 35, Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. And so what we're going to see first, the first principle is that in this notion of separation of church and state, that's that the spiritual nature of the church. The church is a spiritual thing. And that's what it's supposed to be. And so when Jesus talks about his kingdom, is he talking about a physical kingdom? No, because it's not of this world. He knows that when Pilate asked him the question, are you a king? Are you the king of the Jews? That Pilate's thinking physical kingdom. And Jesus is correcting him here and saying, he's not saying he's not the king of the Jews. Okay, but he's saying that my kingdom is not what you think. And he says, my kingdom is not of this world. And so what he is talking about is a spiritual kingdom. So there is the whole concept of when Jesus came and the Jewish people, they see him as, well, he's claiming to be Messiah. In their mind, the Messiah is going to set up a kingdom, and it's going to be a physical kingdom right on earth, right? And hopefully in doing that, he'll overthrow Rome. So that's what they're hoping for. And Jesus, throughout his ministry, is trying to show them that it's not a physical kingdom that I'm talking about. It will be one day. We'll talk more about that later. But at the moment, it wasn't. And so the whole idea of when Jesus is talking about his kingdom, that would be in between, let's say you had the kingdom of Israel, which was a physical kingdom in the Old Testament. And then you have one day coming a physical kingdom referred to as the millennium, the millennial kingdom. But in between that time right now, it's not a physical kingdom. It's a spiritual one. And so that's what Jesus is trying to explain to Pilate. And then he goes on in verse 37, Pilate therefore said unto him, art thou then a king then? Jesus answered, thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. So what was his purpose for being there during his ministry? We know he came to go to the cross. But before he went to the cross, his ministry on earth, he's describing in these words, to bear witness to the truth. It's a spiritual ministry. It's a conceptual thing, right? It's about truth, about ideas, about beliefs, about doctrines. And so that's what his ministry was all about, was bearing witness to the truth. And so the mission was spiritual in nature and not physical. The church, when Jesus died, rose again, ascended to heaven, the church is to carry on his ministry, which is about bearing witness to truth, right? Which is a spiritual thing. And so because of that, that's the first principle, that the nature of the church is a spiritual thing. Now, churches meet together, right? We have what we call local churches, and we meet together in a physical place, and we're physical people. But we're meeting together for a spiritual purpose. Right? And so that's kind of the idea. If somebody does something in the church and they're trying to cause division or something, and the church has to discipline them, what does that look like? Do we bring them up front and beat them? No. Okay. No, not at all. Okay. I know this is going out live, right? No, we don't do that. But what we do, right? It's a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual discipline, right? It's not a physical thing. And so that's the whole idea. The nature of the church, the mission of the church is a spiritual thing. Okay, next principle is the physical nature of the state. So when we're talking about civil government, that is physical in nature. That's what it's dealing with. So if you go down to chapter 19, Jesus talks to Pilate again in verse 9, John 19:9. So Pilate went again into the judgment hall and saith unto Jesus, Whence art thou? Or where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. Then saith Pilate unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee and have power to release thee? So Pilate's kind of offended, right? How dare you not speak to me? Don't you know that I have authority over you? Verse 11, Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me except it were given thee from above. And so Jesus, okay, so he's acknowledging Pilate's authority, isn't he? But where did Pilate get his authority? From God, from above. And so he got it from God. And what Jesus is acknowledging, he's not acknowledging, yes, Pilate, you do have authority, and it's God-given authority, and it's civil authority. Now, where did this whole idea of civil government even come from? Where did it originate from? It goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. And so in the Garden of Eden, you don't have any civil government. After the Garden of Eden, after Adam falls, Cain kills his brother. Is there any government that holds him accountable for that? No, you don't have any civil government yet. And so you don't have that until the time right after the flood. The world got so bad without government. Okay, by the way, this is the reason why we need government. Because if you don't have it, you'll have anarchy. And people will just kill each other. And things will get so bad in the world that God has to flood it. Okay? And that's what happened with the flood. So Noah comes through the flood, and he got his family, and they come off the ark, and God gives some rules to Noah now. Things are very different. Right, the world is very different. Climate has changed. You know, so there's going to have to be different rules now. And God says to Noah, one of the big rules he gives them is if somebody takes a man's life, that man's life is to be taken. And so he gives a rule that now if somebody murders somebody, God says, here's what you need to do. You need to carry out justice on that person. This is where civil government came from. That's the rule. That's the basic rule of civil government. So the question is, well, who's going to carry out that justice? Somebody has to, right? And, so you don't just have a posse going after people whenever they want. The people have to agree to, okay, here's going to be the way that we will make sure justice gets done. And so governments are formed. And that's where it came from. And of course, you go into Genesis chapter 11 and you see like one of the worst governments ever, right? Early on, and that's the Tower of Babel. And you see government gone awry. You see dictatorships, and it just becomes a mess. But the whole idea of civil government came from God. Because of people's sin, so we need to be governed. And so let me show you this one. This is Romans chapter 13. The Bible there's not a lot of places in the New Testament where you read about civil government. It doesn't have a whole lot to say about it. There's a few places, but one of those is Romans chapter 13, verse 1. And Paul says, Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. And so he's talking about civil government. Verse 2, whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation or judgment. Like, he's not talking eternal damnation. He's talking judgment passed against them. Okay. Verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. And so Paul's saying civil government, right? So if you, what is that government for? That government is there to execute justice on a person who does evil. So the civil government is there to carry out justice concerning acts of evil. Okay, actual acts of evil. It's not there to police your thoughts, because government can't read your thoughts, but it's there to police actions. Okay, so that's what government is there for. So government is there on the physical realm. It's dealing with physical things. It's dealing with real actions that take place. By the way, whenever a government starts to make laws about how you think, you're in for trouble. Okay, because government's not there, they're stepping out of their realm at that point. I don't like the whole concept of hate crimes. And I get it. I get what they're doing, but just they should call it something different, because hate is something you do in your heart. It's not about an action that you do. It's about something you're thinking. And should a crime be worse because of how you're thinking, or should it just be based on what you did? So that's a realm where it starts to get a little murky there. And but government is there to deal with physical things, civil actions that are done. So another principle, so you have the church dealing with spiritual things, you have the government dealing with civil things. Should the government then try to deal with spiritual things? That's not their wheelhouse, right? That's not why God ordained it. You keep to the physical things, we'll keep to the spiritual things. That's that original concept of separation of church and state. Another principle that goes along with this is the one that we talked about at our first podcast about individual accountability. Remember, I said that's like the heart of what a Baptist believes, is that this concept of individual accountability or freedom of conscience or soul liberty, the different terms that people use. But it's the idea that every person is accountable to God themselves. So let me show you back in John chapter 18. So when Jesus was before Pilate, again, so John 18, verse 37, Pilate therefore said unto him, art thou a king then? Jesus answered, thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. So he's telling Pilate, if you're of the truth, you'll know that I'm speaking truth. Verse 38, Pilate saith unto him, what is truth? Okay, did Pilate believe the truth? No, he didn't. Right? In fact, he's questioning what even is it. It's Pilate's responsibility before God to believe the truth. Nobody can make him believe the truth. And so Jesus is kind of showing that. Pilate, are you of the truth or you're not? We're told in Romans that every man must give an account of himself to God. And if that's true, nobody can force your beliefs. So government that's dealing with physical matters can't force you to believe anything. Government can't change your opinion on something. They can force you to do an action, or they can restrain you from doing an action. Okay, like if the state of California wanted to close the doors of the church, said you can't meet here, they could physically lock the doors and they could physically keep us out. Could they keep us from worshiping God in our heart? No. And so that's why, again, why government, that's out of bounds for government. They can't control a person's heart. And so government can't legislate what people believe. They can punish behavior, but they can't make you believe something. And so again, this is another principle that where government is one thing, church is another thing. Another principle is the problem of persecution. So back in verse 36 of John 18, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered unto the Jews." Jesus said, okay, if my kingdom was of this world, if it was more than a spiritual kingdom, then my servants would fight. Okay, remember when Jesus was arrested in the garden and Peter took out a sword and he went to get one of the guys there and he ends up cutting off his ear? And Jesus told him, "Peter, put up your sword, put it away." Mm-hmm. And Jesus picked up the man's ear and put it back on him and healed him. And he said to Peter, "If you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword," right? So put it away. That's not what we're about. And right there, he's saying that no, the mission of the church is a spiritual one. It's not a physical one. We're not setting up a physical kingdom on earth right now. And so if it was a physical kingdom, then we might have to use a sword. So churches should never be in a position where they could persecute people. Jesus himself could have annihilated Pilate, right? With one word, but he didn't. And so he's setting an example for this spiritual kingdom. So here's the problem. Historically, okay, you look at history. Whenever the church and state have mixed, it's always led to persecution of people's beliefs. It always comes to that. And why is that? Let's think it through logically. So if the church, let's just say, okay, the church is just going to promote Christianity. It's not going to persecute people. It's just going to promote Christianity. Okay, who's going to decide what Christianity is? State's going to have to. Okay, first of all, do I want the state deciding beliefs, what Christianity is? Okay, so let's say the state says, okay, here's Christianity. Christianity is this set of beliefs, this set of doctrines. What if you have a church that has a problem with one of those things? Or what if you have a church like Baptists who say, the state shouldn't be telling us to do that? Suddenly you're on the wrong side of the state, aren't you? How long can you be on the wrong side of the state before you start getting penalized for that? This is how it works out naturally, and we have all kinds of examples in history to show us that. And so, okay, and let's say the state says we're promoting Christianity. Christianity is the truth. We know that this is true, and you have pastors and stuff that are saying, yeah, this is the truth. And you have one group that one of those things is not so sure about, one of those doctrines or something. And then they say, well, wait a second. When it's a spiritual belief and it's something that they think you're wrong about, that's a bigger deal than just doing some kind of a physical action or some kind of physical crime. Because now it's a thing that might send somebody to hell, right? It's a big deal. And so it normally ends in persecution. So back in the 1500s, time of the Reformation in Switzerland. Okay, so we go to Switzerland, to Zurich, Switzerland, and there's a guy there by the name of Ulrich Zwingli, and he was one of the reformers. And Zwingli had some friends. One of them was his name Franz, was his last name, and another one was Hubmeier, Balthasar Hubmeier, and then there's a Conrad Grebel. And so there are these guys who were friends of Zwingli, and early on, and they were what were called the early Anabaptists. And so early on, they're learning from Zwingli, and they're seeing this stuff, and where he's saying that the Catholic Church is wrong on these things, and he's showing them in Scripture, and they're like, wow, that's true. And then they say, how come there's no infant baptism in the Scripture? And Zwingli's like, oh, hold on, you're going a little too far there. And they said, but there's no infant baptism in the Scripture. Maybe we shouldn't be doing that either. And Zwingli was like, I don't want to go there. And so these friends who worship God together suddenly became enemies. And so they had a debate with their the way the Swiss government was set up. It wasn't one central government. You had different, they called them cantons, like different states. And so they went before this board of elders or whoever there were, whatever their Congress was. And so they go before them, the magistrates, and they have a debate on the whole issue of baptism. And Zwingli's taking the infant baptism side, and these other guys are taking the believer's baptism side. And they side with Zwingli. And so now, basically, the state tells the Anabaptists that you need to baptize your kids. And if you don't, you'll get banished from Switzerland, from our area. And so it got so bad that finally, and they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't baptize their kids. And then finally, it became a thing where they said, okay, there's going to be a death penalty if you don't do it. And the penalty was drowning, of all things, right? Because they're immersing believers. And several of those men were drowned for their faith, under the auspices of a reformer, Zwingli, who would have believed the gospel. And you're like, how did that happen? Well, because the church is promoting, or the state is promoting the church. The state is promoting this version of Christianity to the exclusion of all the others. And so that's one case in history. Another one would be in England in the 17th century. We got Thanksgiving coming up. Pilgrims. Why did the pilgrims come to America? Because they were being persecuted by the Church of England, by the British government. They had to flee to Holland. Then from there, they came to America. And they did it for religious freedom. And then you go, and then not only did the pilgrims come, but then you had Puritans who came after them, and they came over to America as well. And just like a generation later or so, and those very Puritans had the witch trials in Salem. And again, what were they? They killed people. The state killed people over what were beliefs. It wasn't any crime that they committed. It was beliefs that they held. Now, of course, nobody knows were they really witches or who knows, right? I don't know. But that just shows that there was already this that was happening. So anyway, so that's another thing. Another principle too that goes along with it is with the separation of church and state ideas is premillennial eschatology, or what do you believe about end times? And let me show you this briefly. I know our time's running short here. So back in John 18, verse 36, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. He says, now my kingdom is not of this world. That word now is all important, because in he's saying that, implying that there will be a time where it will be of this world. That's when Jesus comes back and sets up his kingdom on earth. But until then, it's not. Until then, it's a spiritual thing. And so we believe that's what we call premillennial, so that Christ will come back and will return before the millennial kingdom to set up his kingdom on earth. There are those who believe what we call postmillennial, that 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 the church's responsibility is to set up Christ's kingdom on earth, and then he will return once that's happened. If you hold to a post-millennial theology, that is consistent with the idea of the church promoting Christianity, because we're building a kingdom on earth, then Christ will come. Premillennial eschatology, we're saying, no, it's a spiritual kingdom right now. We don't have to build a physical kingdom on earth. Christ will do that after he comes. And so that goes along with this concept of separation of church and state. And so, anyway, the traditional Baptist idea of separation of church and state does not go well with the idea of the government promoting Christianity. Do I think people should be Christians? Absolutely. That's what I spend my life doing, right? Trying to lead people to Christ. Do I think the government should make that happen? No. What I want the government to do is to give us the freedom to do it. That's it. I don't want the government supporting us to do that. I don't want the government promoting us to do that. I want the government to leave us alone so we can do our job, which is a spiritual thing, and let the government do their job, which is a physical thing. And that's the whole concept of the separation of church and state. Let me just wrap it up with this. If you got a question, you think of a question, be thinking of that. But this is, so has anybody ever heard somebody talk about the myth of the separation of church and state? Anyone ever heard that term? Okay, that's something that I hear quite often too. And what they say is that, well, the separation of church and state is not in the Constitution, and that phrase never shows up there. It shows up in one place, and it was a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. Let me tell you what that's about, okay? So there was a group of Baptist churches from Connecticut called the Danbury Baptist Association. And so this in 1801, Thomas Jefferson just become president. They wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson. And their concern was that in Connecticut, the government, the state government, specific churches. And it wasn't the Baptists. But the Baptists had to pay money to help support those churches. And they're like, that's not fair, right? We fought a whole war over taxation without representation. And now you're expecting us to support something we don't believe in. And so they write a letter to Thomas Jefferson. And so Thomas Jefferson wrote back, and here's what he said. He said, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should, and now he quotes the First Amendment, should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. So what Jefferson was doing was he was saying, the way I interpret that First Amendment is with this concept of separation of church and state. And the Baptists agreed with him. That's why they supported Jefferson, not because Jefferson was a godly man, because he really wasn't. And his religious beliefs were pretty suspect. A man who owned slaves and stuff, right? And yet, they felt he was right about this. They wanted a president that would leave them alone to do their job. You know, we'll do the spiritual things. You worry about the physical things. You worry about the economy. You worry about things like that. We'll concern ourselves with the spiritual things. That's the church's job. We'll take the role in that. And so anyway, that's that whole concept of separation of church and state. So for that, I would say, no, I'm not a Christian nationalist. And I would not think that it would be a good idea for our government to promote Christianity. Give us a level playing field. We'll promote Christianity. And so, any questions or comments about that? Because what I'm saying tonight goes contrary to what a lot of Christians are thinking now. And it's becoming more and more common, this idea of the government promoting Christianity. So, yeah, Johnny.
So have a lot of Baptist churches gone that route, what you just said currently?
Yeah. And yeah, many have. It's mixed on that.
What percentage would you say it is?
I have no idea. Like our regular Baptist churches tend not to. We tend to stay, no, separation of church and state is a real thing. Yeah, some different Baptist groups, Southern Baptists would be pretty divided on that. But yeah, there is a segment of Southern Baptists that definitely do want the government promoting. Yeah. Any other questions?
I got a question.
Yes.
So about like how government has authority from God. So Jesus said that Pilate had certain authority from God to carry out justice and do the things that government is supposed to do. What does that mean exactly? Like what would Pilate have the authority to do, and when would he be stepping out of that authority? Like, did he have the authority to convict Jesus, for instance, and put him to death? And if he did something out of his authority, what would the consequence be?
Right. So I mean, Pilate had the authority to order a crucifixion for anybody, right? So he had that authority. If he does that to somebody who's innocent, right? And we could debate whether, I mean, crucifixion was a gruesome thing. I mean, that should they have ever even been doing that? No, I don't think so. But if he was to say he was to convict an innocent person, he's obviously abusing the authority that he has, right? So there's a difference between there's a God-given authority. That doesn't mean that civil leaders don't ever abuse that authority. They do it all the time. But yeah.
Is authority different than ability? Is it like the right, or like if a government takes over another country, for instance, they're able to do that and then exercise authority over them.
Yeah.
Is God okay with that?
Well, it's more, I don't think we're not talking about, when we're talking about the authority they have, we're not talking about whether God thinks that what they're doing is right. We're talking about the concept of government that God has set up. We know also that God sets up leaders, he takes down leaders, but he also allows them to do a lot of bad things, right? So like Adolf Hitler would have had authority that was given by God in the sense that he had of the position that he had. Now, as a dictator, and the horrible crimes that he committed, it's not like God was endorsing that. But it's just that the whole concept, the structure of government itself has been set up by God. And that would be kind of more the idea.
Okay. A question, but a comment from the group.
Okay, we got a live chat comment here.
The Bible does not give the state the Bible does give the state a mandate to restrain evil, promote justice, and protect the vulnerable, including children. It's not about enforcing Christianity per se, but upholding basic moral order that aligns with God's design.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good question. So all laws are based on some kind of morality, right? And so when we're saying that the government shouldn't promote Christianity, we're not saying that the government shouldn't have good morals, right? And this is the problem that we're facing in America right now, is that morality has changed, right? So let's say back in the 1950s, 1960s, there was, well, among among white America anyway, there was a concept of these are basic morals that most people share. And even in the black community too, I mean, obviously some issues of civil rights they would disagree on, right? But a lot of the basic morals they would share. Sexual revolution changed a lot of that, right? So morals regarding, you know, sexuality and things like that vastly changed, big time. And since then, things have been changing a lot more. And so when those morals change in America, that tends to change laws too. And so we're not saying that the government shouldn't be moral. I think it's the place of the church to say this is what morality is, right? We're ones speaking for God, right? We're telling you what morality is, and we're hoping the government will understand that. But as far as enforcing religious belief, that's a different matter. And so, like, let's take the issue of abortion, right? The issue of abortion isn't talking just about belief, it's talking about actions, right? And so, so yes, you can say this should be illegal because of the action that is being done. You're going after the vulnerable, in this case, a baby in the womb, right? And so, to say that the government should be anti-abortion is not saying that it's promoting Christianity. It's just saying it's promoting good morals. So hope that kind of helps understand. But with that, I mean, it does get kind of tricky, right? It does get kind of tricky with that because where do people's morals come from, right? And so it can get kind of tricky that way. So, yes.
That brings up another question for me: is
Okay.
At what point do you consider the line to be crossed from morals into religion?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think government-wise, it's going to have to be actions, right? And there is a concept of natural law, a concept of that God gives people a conscience, and whether they're a Christian or not, they have a conscience. They've been made in the image of God. It's something that theologians call common grace, meaning that there are things which are natural and things which are against nature. And so that's the realm that government is dealing in, I think. So yeah, at what point is that line crossed? I think different people would argue on that. Yeah, Andrew.
So would you say it would be good for government to be Christian in as far as it punishes actions that are wrong? So do you think a government that has morals consistent completely with Christianity, that would be a good thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so, yeah,
But it just should a step further than that.
That would be the ideal government, right? The government that would have morals that were consistent with the Bible. That would be the ideal government. Absolutely.
Jesus tells us that the broad gate, the gate that leads to destruction is broad, and the gate that leads to righteousness is narrow,
Right.
which tells us that a majority of people will be on their way to destruction. So if we make a nation that we say is Christian and we elect leaders who have to affirm that Christianity, logic tells us the vast majority of them will not be true believers.
Right.
Because
Right.
most people in this world are not true believers. So if we have a state that is religious, most of the people will not actually be practicing that religion in their heart, which is what you had in Israel.
Right.
And so we will have leaders. If you make a religious test for leadership, like to hold office,
Mhm.
you will end up with a majority of leaders that are affirming something they don't really believe,
Mhm.
that are just hypocrites.
Right. Right. And that's one of the problems with a state church, or church state, is that well, and like even with that's why we don't practice infant baptism, right? There's that idea that a baby's baptized, they become part of a church. Is that child really at what point? I mean, maybe they were baptized as a baby, but they don't believe the gospel, and they're still part of a church, and you start to get problems that way. And so I, as Baptists, we also would say that no, that to be baptized, you need to be a believer first. To be part of the church, to be like a church member, you need to be a believer. But the other, when you start having a church state situation, you do end up with a lot of hypocrisy. And so, yeah. And you might end up with a leader who is a very non-Christian man or woman who is promoting Christianity. And if you have somebody who's not a Christian and who is not very moral in their own life promoting Christianity, it puts a bad name on Christianity, doesn't it? And it makes it kind of odious to the unsaved world. And so, yeah. All right. Well, we are out of time. We went long tonight. So God bless you all, and thank you.